I wanted to do a video on how to breed, and I wanted to get that out over the weekend. I just didn't get to it. But the more I thought about it, I thought it'd be more beneficial to put out a different type of video before that video. Essentially, do a video on the things that you need to think about before you decide to become a breeder. I've been keeping reptiles for over 30 years, almost 35 years. And for a long time, I didn't actually breed for the good portion of that 30 plus years. I just kept reptiles because I enjoyed keeping them. It wasn't until about, well, 2004 that I really decided that, since I have all this stuff, I might as well start breeding it. And to be honest, I should have started breeding before that. It just wasn't, I didn't really worry about trying to make money off my pets. I just had them as pets. But since I had so many, it kind of just made sense to start breeding, and that's kind of how it all started. A lot of times the questions that you think you need to ask before you start breeding is what species, um, what morphs, what localities. And that's not really the first set of questions you need to ask yourself. The first set of questions are how much space do you have? So you need to figure out how much space you have to actually work with, and then calculate from there how many reptiles, regardless of what they are, you can keep in that space appropriately, not stacked on top of each other, not crammed in there, not reducing the cage space size for the animals so you can have more cages in there. So, what you can keep, the amount of space you have to keep the animals correctly, that's the first thing you really need to calculate. The next thing you need to think about is how much time do you have to work with these animals. So you need to figure out how much free time you have in a week. And after you come up with that number, you have to ask yourself another question. And this is the most important question, is how much of your free time do you want to have occupied taking care of reptiles? Because if you have an extra 20 hours every week that you could be spending in your snake room, but there's other things you would like to do, like watch TV, go out and do stuff, whatever it is, maybe other hobbies, other interests, and you only want to spend 10 hours a week on your reptiles, that's going to determine just how much stuff you can really have. So you have your space, how much free time you have, and how much free time you actually want to allot to the care and maintenance of these animals. So those are the questions you have to ask first. And if you don't answer those questions first, the rest of the stuff is really irrelevant, because it will have to work itself out in a trial and error type of way as you move forward. One of the big mistakes all of us make is we get too much stuff. We get too much stuff, we get burnt out, we end up having to let go of animals just because we don't have the time or we don't have the drive to deal with all of them. So I would recommend, if you're new to breeding or you're planning on becoming a breeder, is to just be honest with yourself about how much time you really want to spend cleaning cages. That is a huge question that you need to answer. And if it's only 10 hours a week and you don't have any help, or you can't employ somebody to help you, then your collection size needs to reflect that 10 hours a week to allot to taking care of your animals. So after you answer those questions, now you have to pick the species, and obviously for this video we're talking about retics. Now that you've decided on retics, you got a couple choices here. You have mainland, you have dwarf, and you have super dwarf. And if you look at the markets as they sit right now, the market for mainlands is, now that you've decided on retics, you got a couple choices here. You have mainland, you have dwarf, and you have super dwarf. And if you look at the markets as they sit right now, the market for mainlands is continually going down. It's becoming smaller and smaller for when it comes to the higher end animals being sold and the demand for those animals. Most people are moving towards dwarf and super dwarfs, and a lot of people that are coming into retics, that's really all they're interested in. There's not a lot of new people coming into retics looking for a mainland size animal. So from the financial aspect of this, it really makes sense to go the super dwarf or dwarf route. There's two types of new people coming into retics. There's the people that have bought into the hype of it and they think their snakes are actually only going to get 5 feet. Those people are either not going to last and get rid of their stuff, or they're going to accept the fact that they were given bad information and their snakes are going to get larger. So your best customer in retics right now is the customer that understands that these snakes, even dwarfs and super dwarfs, do get still potentially a decent size. So those make the best customers, the people that aren't in denial about what these animals are and haven't been misinformed to the point that they just don't understand what the potential for these animals are, and have been misinformed to the point that they will only listen to a handful of people, and those handful of people are the ones feeding them the misinformation. There's a lot of people like that right now that are being fed this poor information about potential size, bloodlines, and a whole bunch of other nonsense, and they're only believing the source that it's coming from. They're not willing to accept any other kind of information from any other breeder or from any other keeper. So those people will be problematic in the future, and they probably won't be a customer because they're not going to make it. They're going to get rid of their snakes. These are the same people that got their first snake as a retic, or one of their first snakes as a retic, and they have no idea what they're in for and just how much work a retic can be and the potential growth if they feed it properly. With the market being focused towards dwarfs and super dwarfs, you still need to remember that there's been a lot of hype and a lot of trend and fad, as there is in every market, and the retic market is no different. So that is one thing to take into consideration, is your customer base, and some of that customer base just won't be there, and that's how it always is. This isn't new. This isn't just because super dwarfs and dwarfs have got hyped up. There's always been a group of people that jump into reptiles regardless of what species they're keeping and last 3 to 5 years, and then they just get out. That's just, I don't know why that is. That's just how it's always been. I've watched this happen over and over for 30 years. So that's something to take into consideration, that you're going to have an ever-changing customer base. So I would recommend you're going more towards dwarfs and super dwarfs. If you want to go into mainlands, that's fine. Just you need to understand that the prices have continually went down, and there's fewer and fewer people that are looking for a mainland retic and willing to pay a significant amount of money for it. So there's a lot of dumb people with $100 or $200 or $300 willing to buy something from Bob Clark's auction on Facebook. Those, you don't want those customers, because most of those customers have no business buying a retic to begin with. So you really want to target the customers that understand what they're buying and at least have a little bit of money, because once you get up to about that $500 mark, that typically eliminates a lot of stupidity. So that's kind of where you want to be. You don't want to be producing too much under the $300 mark. You really want to try to get it up towards the $500 mark. But there's also this other aspect that nobody talks about, at least from breeders that are trying to sell you high-end animals. They don't tell you this. Almost all sales in the reptile industry are for animals that are $1,000 or less. The average person buying a reptile is looking for a pet, if they're looking for the enjoyment of the experience of keeping the animal, most of those people have $1,000 or less to spend. That $300 to $1,000 is the sweet spot for pricing for selling for pets. That's very crucial to understand that, because the majority of people looking to buy a reptile want it as a pet. They're not trying to be some big breeder. They're not trying to do anything crazy. They just like and enjoy keeping the animals. So that's what they do. But once you start really getting under that 300 mark, that really opens up the door to a lot of people that shouldn't be buying a reticulated python to begin with. But once you get under that 300 mark, it's within their price range. And now they're no longer buying the $250 ball python. They're buying the $250 retic. And they don't need either snake, but it's still better that they have the ball python than the retic, because the ball python's not going to kill their step kid or whatever, or get out. It's just not going to end up on the news, chances are, like the retic is. And when they go to rehome it, it'll be a lot easier to find that ball python a home. That is the reality of what really sells. A lot of snakes up in that 2,500, 5,000, 10,000, 20. It's like those sales aren't as frequent as breeders would lead you to believe when they're trying to sell you that $5,000 snake. And that $5,000 snake depreciates because the people that do spend the $5,000 on it are buying it and saying, well, I'll produce 100 of these, and then I'll have 100 $5,000 snakes. Well, there isn't 100 people with $5,000 that are interested in buying that snake. So those prices come down because of that. So you need to be realistic in your breeding, and you need to shoot for stuff in that $1,000 range for your production. For selling, you can still make the $2,500, the $5,000, the $10,000 animals, but you're going to sell a lot more retics for $500, $600, $700, $800 than you are for $5,000 a piece. That is the reality of this. And it's not, and nobody is really explaining that, especially to the new people. All the breeders understand it, but they don't like to talk about it. So another aspect of this is the overproduction. One thing that breeders don't talk about is the need to call excess of stock. I call a lot of stuff. I don't talk about it, I don't really advertise it, but I put down a lot of stuff, because a lot of that stuff that's cheaper, those extra males, they end up just in the wrong hands, and it's better to just put them down after they hatch out and be done with it. That way you're not worrying about it, you're not inclined to sell them cheaper than maybe you should, and doing that just drives the market down. They're not getting into the wrong hands. So preventing the overproduction through calling and keeping prices stable, while at the same time trying to limit the amount of retics getting into the wrong hands, is probably the most responsible thing you can do in your breeding. What I suggest is, whatever species you really want to work with and focus on your breeding projects, have that be roughly 75% of your collection. Because one thing that happens over time is you start to get burnout on a single species or what you're doing, and there's always other stuff in reptiles that you're interested in. So I recommend leaving 25% of your collection to different species that you're very interested in working with, just for the enjoyment of it. Now, if you can work with them in a way to monetize that work and effort you're putting in, that is great. But make sure you're getting at least some different species into your collection to break up the monotony of working with just a single species. and make sure it's stuff that you really like and you're not really worried about whether or not you breed it or what kind of market it is. Just find things you like and bring them in and work with them to break up the monotony of just that one species. Trust me on that. I don't talk about it much. I keep Timors, I keep scrub pythons, I keep white lips, I keep red-tailed boas. I have some other stuff coming in this year that I'm excited about working with. I'll be talking about that in other videos. It's just nice to work with something different. So that is something I do recommend. For breeding programs, what I recommend is, first and foremost, get what you like. If you really like mainlands, get the mainlands. Just accept the fact that the market sucks. You like dwarfs and super dwarfs, get the localities you like. Don't worry about what's hyped up now. Don't worry about what you see everybody else doing. Get what you like and make sure a significant portion of your breeding programs are what you like. Now, if there's something specific that you know is always going to sell and you're not super into, but you still recognize the need to bring in some sort of monetary gain to at least pay for all of this or make some money, then you need to bring in those morphs to work with. And albinos, platinums, tigers, simple stuff like that will always sell. Always has sold, always will. So try to keep a lot of that stuff pretty simple, and that simple stuff typically will stay in that $1,000 or less range, and it has that general aesthetic value that appeals to the customer looking for a pet. You want to have that mindset as, maybe I do need to produce a little bit more of something that I don't necessarily specifically personally really like, but I like it enough to work with it and to make sure I can supply a demand in a responsible manner, and that will generate the funds I need to either make a profit or at least pay for feeding and housing in your time. So the financial compensation you need is whatever you decide it is you need. If your goal is to make $1 million, don't do retics. That's my recommendation. If your goal is to make $20, $30, $40, $50,000, you can pretty much pick any species you want and do that, and breed responsibly in the process. Get the localities you like, the morphs you like, and put together a breeding plan. And it doesn't matter what any of that is. Just make sure that you really like it, and what you're attracted to about those localities or morphs isn't the hype you're seeing on the internet. Because if you really like something because you see everybody else talking about it, like how hyped up Kalatoas are or any kind of super dwarf cross, do you really like that? And do you really like how it looks? And does that animal really have good aesthetic value? Or has it just been hyped up and it's a trend? Because these trends create bubbles, and these bubbles pop, and overproduction happens, and prices plummet, and they drop significantly. So make sure you're getting something that you actually truly like, not something you like because of how many likes it gets on Facebook. Now that you've figured out exactly what you like, and you figured out what you want to work with, you figured out how much space you have, and how much time you're willing to put into it, you can really put together a plan. Personally, I suggest a mix of a handful of morphs and a handful of localities. You need super dwarf blood so you can constantly be downsizing to appeal to the customer that wants a manageable snake. You got the dwarfs that allow for a larger animal but still supply that big snake experience, and they fit in 6-foot cages, which is what everybody has. In my opinion, that is the most responsible way to breed reticulated pythons. Produce stuff that fits in 6-foot vision cages. and that is a snake that's 14 foot or less. If you can get them down in that 12-foot range or less, even better. But that's still a lot of snake, and it will still give that person who wants a large constrictor that big snake experience. And as somebody who's kept a lot of really large retics, the longer I did this, the more I do it, the novelty of 17-foot plus retics wears off very quickly when you're cleaning cages, because you're so exhausted after the fourth or fifth one that you want to throw in the towel for the day on cleaning, because it's a massive, ridiculous amount of work. And the feeding is ridiculous. So try, if you want big snakes, like truly big, I suggest you get a Sola. You get Solas or something like that, or Malaysians, and just get a pure locality to have for the big stuff. Or if there's a specific morph you like that you know is real heavy on mainland and comes maybe from some larger bloodlines, get one or two of those to satisfy that I want a really big snake need. And then the rest of your stuff needs to be manageable size, because the manageable size is what's marketable to the person looking for a pet. As I said, you got your dwarfs, you got your super dwarfs, you have your morphs. A lot of morphs, in my opinion, look really bad once you start combining them together. And unfortunately, Super Dwarf and Jampin Coyote don't have the color spectrum or the black to add to the contrast of those animals. So if you really like Jamps and you really like Coyotes, then get them. But if you're looking to really improve your animals, get a different dwarf. Whether it's the stuff I got, whether it's stuff somebody else has, honestly, I would just get that. But you really need to have some sort of super dwarf blood in your collection so you can constantly be downsizing the morph you're working with, and you can constantly be increasing aesthetic value with locality traits from dwarfs that have the proper color spectrum and pattern structure and thickness of black that's needed to make those corrections to the offspring you're producing that have the super dwarf blood in them. So that is really what I would suggest you do before you really go down this path of breeding reticulated pythons. The breeding video I want to do is going to take a little bit longer and a little bit more work than I thought it would, so it's not going to come out. I wanted to have it this week, and I just couldn't get it done. But I really wanted to do this first to have a realistic conversation that brings up the topics that other breeders aren't going to tell you, and that is the reality of breeding reticulated pythons. Most breeders, and me included, want to make a bigger cell versus a small cell, and you can make an upsell to an extent, and after a certain extent, it's not an upsell, it's a sales pitch, and it's irresponsible. I really hope as you go down the breeding road, you really think about space, time, what you really want to work with, your willingness to call excess offspring, and understanding that everything kind of flows. So you have your ups and downs. In retics, you have them everywhere else. So, and there's trends now, and those trends like X locality and X morph, and then within a year they're gonna like Y locality and Y morph, and you just have to be able to flow with that. And it's a lot easier to flow with that when you're working with what you enjoy, and you're not so focused on trying to meet demands of trends that are constantly changing. As long as you're breeding in responsible numbers and they're a manageable size, you will be able to sell your animals, and you don't have to worry about trying to hype up your animals. And if you're working with the localities that are improving the looks, your animals will have the higher aesthetic value than your competitor. So you're putting yourself in the best possible position to have long-term success. And that's just something that I have to constantly remind myself of every day, because I have to remember that it's more important that I have my ternates and have created a sustainable locality for captive reproduction when I see snakes that don't look half as nice as mine selling for more money. Long term, I'm better off. Long term, I have a better product. I'm not saying you need to buy ternates or you should or you shouldn't, but I'm saying position myself better for the long term than I would have if I would have tried to position myself for hype and trends. And that's what I recommend you do. So, and remember, leave up to, if you can bring yourself to do it, leave 25% of your collection, that space you have, for different species to work with strictly for the enjoyment of working with them. I can't stress that enough to break up the monotony. So, but I hope this was helpful, and I'm working on that, putting together that breeding video, and hopefully I can get that done this week. Like, it's going to be at least an hour long, so, and I got to bring up stuff from that chapter on breeding for that book that I wrote. I got to print all that out, show those numbers. It's just going to be a lot of work. I thought it'd be a little easier at first, but the amount of information once I started writing it down was pretty extensive. So hopefully I'll have that out by the end of the week, and I hope this video was helpful.